Hi, it's Rachel here again. I'm going to attempt to make a video. I haven't made one for a wee while, and this one will probably be a bit meatier than my usual car witnessing ones. I've been a bit homebound lately because I've got an Achilles tendonitis that's bothering me at the moment, plus some awful arm pain, which I think is linked to some muscles, and I can't do my usual activities, so it's been a great opportunity to put together something to make a video. So I've been reading some pretty heavy duty books, just a little bit. I'll show you the books in a minute, but this video has really sprung, or the idea from this has sprung from a post that I made on Facebook recently, and I'll just spin my phone around so you can see my post on my page, which I have up on my desktop. So I have a post there featuring this book. Is it gonna... Oh. You see what I did there? Okay, alright, yes, I don't touch the screen on here, that's my phone that I can do that. Anyway, I have to click on here. So this is the image that I posted here, this book. And if you're an ex-witness, you may be very familiar with this. The Time Is at Hand, a book written by Russell, and he wrote it in 1889. Now, what's so special about this particular book, or so astonishing, I should say? Let's go to my post. What does the Bible say about following those who say the time is at hand, which we see was the title of that book? From Luke 21:8, for many will come in my name, claiming, I am he, and the time is near. But he said to them, beware that you be not deceived, for many shall come in my name, and they shall say, blah, 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 blah. Be not misled, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. Also at Matthew 24:4-5, 23-27, he said something similar. And then he stated, look, I have forewarned you. So my question is here, so why did C.T. Russell, founder of the JW religion, write a book with the title The Time Is at Hand, written 1889? And why did thousands follow him? Why didn't they heed the admonition from Jesus Christ himself? Going after Russell and his successors has led them round in doctrinal circles. Today, JWs number over 8 million. Numbers don't make the religion true. The JW religion has a history that is fraught with doctrinal flip-flops, reversals, unfulfilled predictions and promises, some that have led to the deaths of thousands. This, all the while professing they alone have the truth. And then I just added, it is true that man dominates man to his injury. It is so easy to control and have power over people in a religious environment where mere human leaders claim that they alone have authority to speak for God. Okay, and I'm sure that for those who subscribe to my channel, they would agree with that. Anyway, I'm going to do a very low-tech thing, and hello. I'm going to hang my phone up. This is ridiculous. If you want to laugh, have a look what I'm doing. This is a weight, and I'm going to hang it off my phone, which has a bulldog clip on it, and I'm going to hang it over the front of my monitor. That's pathetic, isn't it? I am just so low tech. I hope it works. Okay, it's working. And I think I'm going to turn off my computer because I'm not going to need it, and it makes a bit of a noise, so I'll shut that down. Anyway, so the books that I'm going to talk about is this one, by our beloved Raymond Franz. Very, very brave, honest man. And this book, I don't know how you pronounce his name, another ex-witness wrote this very extensive book about the history of the organisation and its ever-changing doctrines and things. It's very good. And of course this one, which was published by JWs Witnesses in 1993, which is a somewhat sanitised version of the history of the organisation. But of course now they prefer people don't really look at this one. They want to look at the book God's Kingdom Rules, which is a small book and it's an extremely, extremely reduced, summarised and sanitised version of the history of the organisation. They don't really want people finding out the history of the organisation because it would create doubt in the current claims of the organisation. Okay, so what are the current claims? Well, we have the faithful and discreet slave, who have now been reduced to just the men of the governing body, which currently are 8 men. And they claim that they have been appointed by Jesus Christ to relay the truth to mankind, basically. But are these supposed truths that they are relaying today any more reliable than the truths that the faithful slave was feeding Christians back in the day, back when Russell started up in the 1870s? Are they any more reliable? Because there were precious truths that they were teaching people back then, which have been long forgotten and discarded today. So one of these truths, I've got some notes because I've got so many things swimming around in my head. It's all very jumbly. Okay, so something that had huge emphasis back at the beginning with Russell was the Bible chronology. It was pretty much a central doctrine for Russell back in the beginning and back when he started publishing the magazine, the Watchtower magazine. So what they believed back then was that Jesus' presence, his presence in kingdom power, began in 1874. But you hardly ever hear about that today, do you? It's just, swept under the carpet and long forgotten. But it was very important, and it's the main reason why Russell went on to found the Watchtower. I think he called it, first it was Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. They dropped the Zion part of the title at some point. But it was the Herald of Christ's Presence, which was of key importance. And he believed that had already started in 1874. So it was a current presence that he was proclaiming to the world, which of course, according to today's doctrines with the JWs Witnesses, that was not the case. Jesus was not present in 1874. They believe his presence now began in 1914 and that his kingdom power in that same year. But that wasn't the case back at the start. So to show you how important the Bible chronology was to Russell, I'm going to read you some quotes from these books. Hope you've stuck with me so far. Okay, I want to go to the Proclaimers book first of all. I've written these page numbers down and I'll just read you a few bits. So from Proclaimers book, page 47, I would just also mention that I don't know how much recording space I've got left on my phone, so if I just suddenly stop and cut out, I will pick it up and do a part 2, but I'll have to make some more room on my phone to record because I'm already at 9 minutes and it only feels like I've been talking for 2 minutes. Anyway, so page 47, and I'm going to read under the subheading Resolved upon a vigorous campaign for the truth. C.T. Russell was a man of positive convictions. Convinced that Christ's invisible presence had begun, he was determined to proclaim it to others. He later said, "The knowledge of the fact that we were already in the harvest period gave to me an impetus to spread the truth as I never had before." So he's calling it the truth. "I therefore at once resolved upon a vigorous campaign for the truth." Russell now decided to curtail his business interests so as to devote himself to preaching. To counteract wrong views regarding the Lord's return, Russell wrote the pamphlet The Object and Manner of Our Lord's Return. It was published in 1877. Okay, so to counteract wrong views, and of course his view is now completely rubbished by Jehovah's Witnesses. That same year, Barber, who I think was a Second Adventist, and Russell, they jointly published Three Worlds and the Harvest of This World. This 196-page book discussed the subjects of restitution and biblical time prophecies. Though each subject had been treated by others before, in Russell's view, this book was the first to combine the idea of restitution with time prophecy. It presented the view that Jesus Christ's invisible presence dated from the autumn of 1874. It's interesting that this book by the Jehovah's Witnesses just says they presented the view that his invisible presence was from 1874. But back at that time, in fact, right up until in the 1930s, it was considered a fact that Jesus was invisibly present from 1874, not just a view. I'll carry on. As Russell travelled and preached, it became evident to him that something more was needed to keep the seeds of truth he was sowing alive. Seeds of truth, okay, seeds of truth that Jesus' invisible presence began in 1874. The answer? A monthly journal, said Russell. So he and Barber decided to revive publication of the Herald, which was a magazine that Barber had going, but had been suspended because of cancelled subscriptions. So Russell contributed his own funds to revive the journal, becoming one of its editors. And that went well for a while until he and Barber had a parting of the ways with some Bible doctrines. I just want to read a couple of paragraphs from the next page here. Did Russell take full credit for uncovering these gems of truth? Explained Russell. We found, this is quite funny, we found that for centuries, this is what he's saying, we found that for centuries various sects and parties had split up the biblical doctrines amongst them, blending them with more or less of human speculation and error. We found the important doctrine of justification by faith, blah, 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 goes on to other doctrines. Okay, so he talks about human speculation and error. And I have got some other quotes that sort of relate to that I'll get to eventually. On the next page, it says, concerning the chronology he often presented, Russell stated, when we say our chronology, we merely mean the one we use, the Bible chronology, which belongs to all of God's people who approve it. As a matter of fact, it was used in practically the form we present it long before our day, just as various prophecies were used to a different purpose by Adventists, and just as various doctrines we hold and which seem so new and fresh and different were held in some form long ago. And he talks about some other teachings. Then how did Russell perceive the role that he and his associates played in publishing scriptural truth? He explained, our work has been to bring together these long scattered fragments of truth and present them to the Lord's people, not as new, not as our own, but as the Lord's. We must disclaim any credit even for the finding and rearrangement of the jewels of truth. He further stated, The work in which the Lord has been pleased to use our humble talents has been less a work of origination than of reconstruction, adjustment, harmonization. Like no one at that time, Russell and his associates proclaimed worldwide the meaning of the Lord's return and of the divine purpose and what it involved. So he acknowledged here that in the past, like with the Adventist movement and those that preceded them, there were little bits of truth blended in with a lot of human speculation and error. But no, Russell was going to clear out all that speculation part and just stick with the chronology from the Bible, he says. But we can see that chronology that he was proclaiming worldwide at that time was just the result of human speculation and was an error, because none of what he predicted actually came to fruition. So he can't say that it was just sticking with the Bible chronology, can he? So I thought that was quite interesting. Now, also, page 132, there's something there I want to read. I hope this is making sense. I'm finding it very hard to keep it all together in my head. Okay, on page 132, there's a subheading, Manner of the Lord's Return. So this was a pamphlet that he put out to correct all the misinterpretations and misunderstandings of those who went before him. It was in the mid-1870s that Brother Russell and those who were diligently examining the scriptures along with him discerned that when the Lord returned, he would be invisible to human eyes. Brother Russell later said, "We felt greatly grieved at the error of Second Adventists who were expecting Christ in the flesh, and teaching that the world and all in it except Second Adventists would be burned up in 1873 or 1874, whose time settings and disappointments and crude ideas generally as to the object and manner of his coming brought more or less reproach upon us and upon all who longed for and proclaimed his coming kingdom." Although they did think that they did believe that Jesus had took up his kingdom power in 1878, I think it was. These wrong views, so generally held of both the object and manner of the Lord's return, led me to write a pamphlet, The Object and Manner of Our Lord's Return. This pamphlet was published in 1877, and he distributed 50,000 copies of it. Okay, so he felt that he was correcting what the Adventists before him had predicted, their time settings and disappointments and crude ideas. So here he believed he was presenting the truth, which we know today Jehovah's Witnesses no longer believe any of this, yet it was the truth back then. So we have to ask, what about the truth today that they are teaching, and particularly about 1914, is this in the future going to be swept under the carpet and disregarded completely? I suspect it will be. So following this, I have another little, first of all, I've got little squiggly marks in my book to tell me where to go. Page 135. Yeah, this was interesting. So notice in this book, published by Jehovah's Witnesses in their sanitized history, it says, as the years passed and they examined and re-examined the scriptures, their faith in the prophecies remained strong. Okay. And they did not hold back from stating what they expected to occur. With varying degrees of success, they endeavoured to avoid being dogmatic about details not directly stated in the scriptures. I found that hilarious. Varying degrees of success, they endeavoured to avoid being dogmatic. Okay, he was very, very dogmatic, particularly, both Russell and then after him Rutherford, very dogmatic about their Bible chronology being correct. Actually, there was another, I think it was on page 10. This ties in with what I've just been reading. If you see my eyes moving around, I'm just checking the time, how much time I've got that I've been recording and whether it's still recording. Okay, so in this judgment day must wait, he notes, well, this is what Russell actually said in one of his books in 1889. Odium attaches to the study of prophetic time by reason of past misapplications of it by Second Adventists and others, and the consequent failures to realise the events expected to occur at stated times. We see, however, that even this has been a part of God's plan to obscure the subject to all but the class for whom it was intended, by permitting contempt and ridicule to attach to it, thus hindering the worldly wise and prudent from apprehending it. Our Adventist friends have failed to recognise both the manner and the object of the Lord's return. In other words, so this is the author's commentary here of this book. In other words, God has obscured these matters for the Adventists because the biblical truths that they had been so near to grasp had obviously been reserved for Russell and his small selected group of followers. In this way, the Adventist friends performed a preparatory work that lasted more than 30 years and was a part of God's schedule. So this is what Russell taught, that what the Adventists had been doing was like preparing the field for harvesting kind of thing, a preparatory work before Jesus' presence in 1874. Okay, let's see if I've got any other quotes to read from there. Okay. So I just want to do a little bit of a sideways move here and talk about this, the 1874 date that Russell basically became convinced to believe through Barber, who's a Second Adventist. How did the Adventists come to this date of 1874? Well, they originally had the date of 1844, and it was because of the failures of that date, because they thought Jesus would return and cleanse the earth and take up kingship and everything in that year. When that didn't come to fruition, they kept moving the dates. At first it was like the months. Oh, it wasn't May or March or whatever date it was, it's October, and they keep moving the dates like the early witnesses did a bit with 1914 and then 1915 and then subsequent dates, 1925, and quite a few dates actually going through the decades. So it ended up migrating to 1874. But I've got some quotes to read from this book about how these changes came about. So on page 15, looking at the Millerites. he got the 1843 date that the Adventists picked up. And there were lots of different Adventist groups and split-offs, and it's all very, very messy, and I can't possibly remember it all. But it says Miller arrived at the date of Christ's second coming via an amateurish interpretation of the Book of Daniel, chapter 8, verse 14, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. By juxtaposing the 2,300 days with the 70 weeks spoken of in Daniel 9, the commandment of the restoration of Jerusalem in Daniel 9:24-27, he concluded that both the days and weeks had their starting point in the year 457 BCE. In Deuteronomy 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:5-6, he discovered another previously used calculation formula. One prophetic day equaled 1 year. So by starting at 457 BC and counting 2,300 years, Miller arrived at 1843. Therefore, in 1843, the world would be cleansed. So that's how they came to that date. And because of that date failing, although some of them, what's her name, White, the Adventist woman, Ellen White, yeah. She said that, well, in fact, it did come true. Jesus did return in 1843, 44, but it was just invisible. He was invisibly present. But not everyone followed with that and accepted that. So they were still expecting a visible presence, a lot of them. So, okay, that went to it migrated to the 1874 date. And the reason why that happened, we can read on page 38 of the same book. So this is hitting a literal creation. And things will start to make sense for any of you witnesses or ex-witnesses watching. In the 18th century, Adventists held the notion that God created the world in 6 literal days, and at that time, almost 6,000 years prior, Adam had been created. Barber added the missing years, 21 to be exact, to the 5,979 years, and consequently 6,000 years after Adam's creation, calculated to something around 1873. Russell had his own theories, with each creative day being 1,000 years long, but going by the supposed date of Adam's creation, he worked out that the start of the 7th day of creation, which would be the millennial reign, would be around that date of 1873. So they both came to around the same time, 1873. And what you find interesting is that the same reasoning and calculations applied for the 1975 date that Jehovah's Witnesses later on would pick as a date to watch out for Jesus' return, as Armageddon, the end of everything, because they actually, I haven't read up as to why, but they added on 100 years made it 100 years later, I think, that Adam was created. They realised that their calculations were in error or something. So that's where the 1975 date came from and all the kerfuffle that followed that. Oh. Anyway, so the 1874 date did not see any physical return of Jesus. And so that's when Russell adopted this idea that it was an invisible presence of Jesus, that he did in fact return in 1874. His presence began then, but it was invisible. So, first of all, though, I just want to read some quotes. I've got up to 30 minutes already. I hope you're still with me. So all this chronology was presented as biblical truth from God, not from men's speculations and like Russell had accused those before him of making errors because of speculation. No. What he was presenting was the truth. So let's have a look at some quotes. So I want to look at, I think it must be Ray Friend's book. I haven't said what page it is. I mean what book it is. 250. Yes. Okay, so there was no visible return of Jesus. And the things that they were predicting didn't happen. So I'll just read what it says here. So this is Ray Franz's words. Despite whatever stimulating and sanctifying effect these new forecasts and strong affirmations about some of the old dates may have had, by the year 1922, with 1914 now 8 years in the past, the confidence that many had placed in the Society's time prophecies was wearing thin. The methods the headquarters organisation resorted to in trying to overcome this problem are revealing. They also form a pattern seen again in recent times since 1975. Instead of becoming more moderate in its claims about its interpretations or taking a more modest view of its authority, the organisation became far more insistent upon conformity. The claims about the accuracy of its chronology became more dogmatic. Loyalty to the teachings of the faithful and wise servant, then argued as applying definitely to Pastor Russell, was the watchword. Those who questioned their chronology based on his teachings, which chronology was in turn based on the teachings of N.H. Barber, John Aquila Brown and others, were depicted as not only lacking in faith, but also overly impressed with their own wisdom, as proud, egotistical, ambitious, self-willed, misled by the adversary, and guilty of repudiating the Lord. To give any weight to the testimony of ancient historians, in contradiction of the organisation's dates, was to put confidence in agents of Satan's empire. If that seems difficult to believe, consider the statements made in a steady stream of Watchtower articles during 1922 and 1923. Note the repeated use of terms such as indisputable, correct beyond a doubt, divinely corroborated, absolutely and unqualifiedly correct, incontestably established, proven certainty of divine origin, terms applied to the whole chronological scheme, including 1799, which was when they said the last days began, 1874, the start of Christ's invisible presence, 1878, the start of the resurrection of the anointed, 1881, the time when Russell was fully appointed as the Lord's steward, as well as 1914, 1918, and the most recent prophetic date of 1925, said to have as much scriptural support as 1914. Okay, then in Ray's book, he actually has some, scans of watchtowers, so that you can read these comments, these quotes in their context. And I've just got a couple I want to read. So this is page 252. This comes from which one is it? Most towards God. It's in 1922. March the 1st, 1922. Okay. And Russell Wright, or not Russell, is it whoever wrote it? It's probably Rutherford. The indisputable facts, therefore, show that the time of the end began in 1799, that the Lord's second presence began in 1874. Okay, I'll just leave it at that bit. So there we are, indisputable facts. And page 252, chronology. Oh, chronology. So from the May 15th, 1922 magazine, Watchtower magazine, we have no doubt whatever in regard to the chronology relating to the dates of 1874, 1914, 1918 and 1925. Some claim to have found new light in connection with the period of 70 years of desolation and Israel's captivity in Babylon, and are seriously seeking to make others believe that Brother Russell was in error. Okay, so there we are, no doubt whatsoever. Now, next page. I think in the same magazine, under the subheading Stamped with God's Approval, it was on this line of reckoning that the dates 1874, 1914 and 1918 were located, and the Lord has placed the stamp of his seal upon 1914 and 1918 beyond any possibility of erasure. What further evidence do we need? Using the same measuring line, beginning with the entry of the children of Israel into Canaan and counting the fall of 70 cycles of 50 years each, as clearly indicated by Jehovah's sending of the Jews into Babylon for the full 70 years, it is an easy matter to locate 1925. Probably the fall for the beginning of the antitypical Jubilee. There can be no more question about 1925 than there was about 1914. The fact that all the things that some looked for in 1914 did not materialise does not alter the chronology one whit. Noting the date marked so prominently, it is very easy for the finite mind to conclude that all the work to be done must centre about it, and thus many are inclined to anticipate more than has been really foretold. Thus it was in 1844, in 1874, in 1878, as well as in 1914 and 1918. Looking back, we can now easily see that those dates were clearly indicated in scriptures and doubtless intended by the Lord to encourage his people, as they did, as well as to be a means of testing and sifting when all that some expected did not come to pass. That all that some expect to see in 1925 may not transpire that year will not alter the date one whit more than in the other cases. So, is this doing your head in? Okay, so they say this. Oh, it's so frustrating, isn't it? So they say these dates are founded in scripture, and then they say that they mean certain things are going to happen. But then those certain things don't happen, but the dates still stand. But it's God's way of encouraging them. Okay. The writer of the other book, this one, at some points he says things that when the things that they wrote that would happen in certain dates didn't happen, then they would be really encouraged by being given a new date and things to happen on that date. And they would be excited. They'd be excited about failures. Things would fail, yet they'd still be encouraged and excited because of a new date or new things to happen, which also don't happen. So they get to blame God, saying that's his way of keeping them encouraged and in anticipation. That's weird. I mean, when you look at Deuteronomy 18, it says that the one who says something is going to happen, and he speaks in the name of Jehovah and it doesn't happen, then don't follow them. Don't be afraid of them. And that one should be put to death. But here they are kind of putting the blame on God for these failures, but saying it was a means of him encouraging them. Crazy. Crazy, crazy. Absolutely crazy. This is doing my head in. Okay, let's read what Ray said. Once again, the failed expectations resulting from earlier time prophecies are all charged up to the Lord's account, as of his doing, used by him, doubtless intended by the Lord to encourage his people. Nothing strange is seen in this concept that God in Christ would use falsehood as a means of encouragement for their servants, yet in Scripture we read that God is light, and there is no darkness at all in union with him. The idea that God or his Son employ error in the guidance of Christians is foreign to Scripture. It is clearly an attempt to put the questioning one on the defensive, cast him in the role of complainer against God. Great stress was laid on the claim that to change the chronology presented by even 1 year would be disastrous, would destroy the entire system of chronology advanced by the Society. The fact is that most of the dates used for the BCE period have been changed substantially by the Society in more recent times. No adjective seemed too extreme and no claim too extravagant to be used in insisting on the rightness of what was then called present truth chronology. Keeping in mind that the great bulk of it has since been rejected, consider these claims made in the June 15, 1922 Watchtower. The chronology of present truth might be a mere happening if it were not for the repetitions in the two great cycles of 1845 and 2,520 years, blah, 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 which take it out of the realm of chance and into that of certainty. In accordance with the soundest laws known to science, that we affirm that scripturally, scientifically, and historically, present truth chronology is correct beyond a doubt. Its reliability has been abundantly confirmed by the dates and events of 1874, 1914, and 1918. Okay, yeah. Oh, poor head. Okay, so they presented these things as absolute truth, yet they have been rejected by Jehovah's Witnesses today, and many of them don't even know about these. So again, I ask, what makes them so certain that the faithful slave of today, the truths that they teach as, absolutely certain, they can actually just be the result of their speculation and guesswork and could be thrown out the door tomorrow. And I think giving a little credence to that is the fact that in the 2013 Revised New World Translation, in the appendix at the back, Appendix B1, and I don't have my copy on me right here, but if you go and look at that, you will find in a chart that talks about God's method of ruling that under the date 1914, it doesn't say anything about Jesus taking up kingship or about him being present. It just says that about that date, Satan was hurled from heaven. So they're getting very, very vague, and at least in that appendix in the Bible attributing very little to that date. And it would be an easy enough thing for them to just stop publishing and put out of circulation the book, God's Kingdom Rules. And eventually in decades' time, 1914 could be a date that's just people haven't heard of. Just like witnesses today, many of them haven't heard of the 1874 date for the beginning of Jesus' presence. Yet it was published as an unchanging present truth back then and up until 1930s or so. Okay, there's something else I was going to read, page 253. Up to 45 minutes. Okay. Contrary to what the witnesses book, this one, said, that the brothers were trying not to be dogmatic about their dates, with varying degrees of success, and we read all those quotes from the 1922 Watchtower magazines about, you know, it being indisputable and correct and blah 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 blah. I've been talking too much and now I'm not thinking straight. But back then, it was considered that if you didn't go along with that Bible chronology as presented by the faithful servant, who was Russell at that time, then you were actually going against Jesus Christ himself. So loyalty to Russell's teachings, they were dogmatic about it. It wasn't like, oh, that's just his idea that he has, blah, 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 you know, might not be true, might be. No. Loyalty to the Society's teachings received from Russell was equated with loyalty to God and Christ. To deny Russell's teachings was to deny Christ. This amazing claim is plainly stated in the same issue of the Watchtower. So this is the May 1st, 1922 Watchtower. Jesus clearly indicated that during his second presence, he would have amongst the church a faithful and wise servant, through whom he would give to the household of faith meat in due season. The evidence is overwhelming concerning the Lord's second presence, the time of the harvest, and that the office of that servant has been filled by Brother Russell. This is not man worship by any means. It matters not who Charles T. Russell was, whether he was a doctor, a hod carrier, I don't even know what a hod is, or a seller of shirts. St. Peter was a fisherman, St. Paul a lawyer, but these matters are immaterial. Above all, these men were the chosen vessels of the Lord. Regardless of his earthly avocation, above all, Brother Russell was the Lord's servant. Then to repudiate him and his work is equivalent to a repudiation of the Lord, upon the principle heretofore announced. Yes, so whatever Russell taught was to be seen as coming from the Lord. Just as the faithful slave, the governing body of today, claim that what they teach is coming from the Lord. The truths that we're supposed to trust what they teach is coming from Jehovah through Jesus into the faithful slave. So we should have trust in the faithful slave. And this, I think Garrett Loesch spoke about this in a talk on JW Broadcasting, a couple of years ago, stressing the need to have confidence in their explanations, their understandings of the scriptures. Yet, can you really have more confidence in their understandings of the scriptures, the truth? Can you have more confidence in them today when we see the origins of this religion and at its very beginnings, how Russell was presenting what he considered truth, that he had discovered, that he was ordained by God. He's given this role as a steward, a faithful steward, and that what he taught was was biblically supported, that there was no way it could be changed, and then it's just been forgotten. It's gone. It's past. I don't think there's any reason to believe any of the truth claims of the governing body of today. Okay, so what did happen to 1874? That's a good question, isn't it? I haven't been able to find a lot, and it's all kind of a bit mysterious, this moving away from 1874, and I don't think there's any clear pinpointing in the literature. It's sort of like the writer, I can't pronounce his name, Poole. I think he described it as mysterious. But I can read you what they have said on page 260. I think it's this book. Yeah. So the early Bible students, because they didn't get the name Jehovah's Witnesses until the 1930s, but the early Bible students, so they believed that Jesus' presence began in 1874 and he became king, I think 1878, something like that. And that began to, there were inklings of it being changed back at Cedar Point, Ohio in 1922, when Rutherford gave a talk. I believe it was Rutherford's talk. But the portions of that talk were reproduced in the November 1st, 1922 Watchtower. And this is what was said. I wish I could see if it was... this is Ray saying this. It says that in the 1922 convention, there was a principal talk discussion that built on the foundation already laid by the earlier Watchtower articles. Today, the organisation quotes a small portion of that talk in support of 1914. It ignores the fact that 1799 and 1874 figured with equal strength in the argument advanced, and in the conclusion the audience was then called upon to reach. Okay, so here's some portions of the talk that Ray has underlined some bits, and this is the talk that appeared in the magazine at that time. Bible prophecy shows that the Lord was due to appear for the second time in the year 1874. Fulfilled prophecy shows beyond a doubt, that he did appear in 1874. Fulfilled prophecy is otherwise designated the physical facts, and these facts are indisputable. Okay. Since he has been present from 1874, it follows from the facts as we now see them that the period from 1874 to 1914 is the day of preparation. This in no wise looks like militates against the thought that the time of the end is from 1799 until 1914. The period from 1799 to 1874 could not be said to be a day of preparation, but a day of increasing light. It is not reasonable to think that the king began to make preparations until he was present. So they had thought that, like earlier I mentioned, that Russell had taught that the work of the Adventists, and those, I guess the Millerites before them, had been a preparation work, preparing the fields for harvesting for when Russell and his group would come along and then get rid of all man's speculations and get, blah blah. So they thought it was a preparation work for when Jesus would be present in 1874. But now, I guess it's Rutherford, or whoever gave this talk, is introducing the idea that this preparation work didn't happen at that time period, but in fact happened from 1874 to 1914. So, and the reason, so he says, it is not reasonable to think that the king began to make preparations until he was present. So he was saying that this preparation work must have taken place from 1874 up to 1914. For 6,000 years, God has been, this is what the speaker was saying, for 6,000 years, God has been preparing for this kingdom. For 1900 years, he has been gathering out the kingdom class from among men. Since 1874, the King of Glory has been present, and during that time he has conducted a harvest and has gathered unto himself the temple class. Since 1914, the King of Glory has taken his power and reigns. So there was a change here, because they thought before this talk they had been saying that he was present in 1874 and began and took up his throne in 1878, but now he's saying that he didn't take his power and start reigning as king until 1914. So he slipped in a bit of a sly one there, a bit of a change. So that a preparation period had to happen while the king was present, or before he took up his power, he's saying. So you're probably not following what I'm saying. I'm barely following it myself. But okay. Right, page 261. Next page. Ray says, despite the fierce calls for loyalty to Pastor Russell's teachings and chronology, this 1922 convention talk is remarkable in that it reveals the first sign of a gradual edging away from those very teachings. In The Time Is at Hand, Russell had taught, that's the book that he wrote in 1889. Russell had taught that 1878, being the parallel of his Christ assuming power and authority in the type, clearly marks the time for the actual assuming of power as King of Kings by our present spiritual and visible Lord, the time of his taking to himself his great power to reign. By Rutherford's talk at Cedar Point, so it was Rutherford, these acts, invisible acts, were moved up from 1878 to 1914, a date that had proved empty of all the things forecast and hoped for. It was a start of what would later become an almost wholesale transferal of events assigned to pre-1914 dates up to 1914 and post-1914 dates. So, yeah, so the dates were all moved forward. What's his name here? He also writes about this, page 183. I'm still recording and it's nearly an hour. I hope I've got a little bit more time left. 183. Cleaning up the teachings. I'm going to read under that section there, that one. Rutherford now initiated a gradual clean-up of the doctrines of Christ's second coming and the world's end, and especially Christ's invisible arrival time, which was substantially revised. These revisions, however, took some years to complete, into the late 1930s, because the opposition from the Russellites still lingered noticeably. This resistance lasted until 1931 to 1932, by which time about 75% of the original Bible students had left the movement. Good sense. A lot of good sense. Rutherford had to proceed slowly and carefully. As late as 1930, Rutherford seemed to suggest that Christ's second coming, as implied by and according to Russell's old schedule for the end time, started with an invisible presence from about 1879, as stated in the book Light 1 from 1930. This suggests that Rutherford placed his bets on two horses, 1874 to 1879 and 1914 to 1918. In fact, Rutherford wrote about 1879, but that year was supposedly only mentioned because Russell's magazine Zion's Watchtower was first published that year. So really, the 1874 date, really. Further into the book, Rutherford's main point becomes more evidence, for example, on page 70, where the prophetic years 1874, 1914, 1918 and 1922 are treated. The old Russellites must have had a hard time accepting that the second coming of Christ, in some strange way, had been moved from 1874 to 1879 to 1914 to 1918. Russell had given very strong assurances that he had arrived at 1874 as the year of the second coming with mathematical precision, with the year 1914 as the conclusion of Christ's 40 years of invisible presence. Rutherford discarded all that. It can now be seen that the events pictured, this is what Rutherford goes on to write in his book, it can now be seen that the events pictured in the first 5 seals were fulfilled from 1914 to 1918, but the meaning thereof man could not understand until after the coming of the Lord to his temple in 1918. Prior thereto, the Church had been applying the prophecy of Matthew 24 to the events that came to pass from 1874 to 1914. Not until after 1918 was it understood by the Church that these events apply after 1914, and hence the seals were not open to or discerned by the John class, that is to say, the remnant, until after 1918, and in fact very little until after 1922. Ah! Oh my goodness, it just, oh good grief. And of course this is what in 2012, but published in 2013, the actual understanding of who the faithful and discreet slave was changed. When I came into the truth, it was taught that all the anointed remnant on earth made up the faithful and discreet slave. But then in 2012, they changed that to say that the faithful and discreet slave are only the men on the governing body, and they were only appointed in 1918. That it did not, the faithful and discreet slave did not exist at all from the 1st century onwards until 1918. That's when they came in, the faithful slave came into existence. So the faithful slave right up until 2012 didn't even know who the faithful slave was. So how can you believe anything that the faithful slave says? It just completely does your head in. Anyway, around 1914, Rutherford's advanced and revised arrival schedule for Christ's invisible presence was finally in place, and the official end time, as demonstrated in his book Religion, meant Jesus Christ was enthroned as king in the year 1914, and he came to the temple of God in 1918, and there began the assembling and judging of the consecrated ones. In other words, Christ's invisible return was to be counted from 1914. Yet the year 1914 was and is still maintained as the central year in the chronology. In 1914, the Gentile times ended, just as in Russell's old teachings, but the year 1874 lost its meaning because Christ did not return until 1914 to sit on his heavenly throne and monitor the subsequent collection of the selected ones. And although it was not directly stated that Christ's second coming was 1914, a 40-year leap from 1874, this was the general conclusion. If one constructed a timeline, it would show Rutherford moved the entire end times template forward during the 1930 to 1940 period, so that, for example, what had previously ended in 1914 now started that year. It seems the Society's leadership even then may have had the idea that their new chronology should run at least 40 years into the future. Thus, when 1954 also passed, a new year of interest would emerge, 1974 and later 1975, and on and on. The chronology leapt forward as the leadership needed. And don't we see that happening? You know, we see, although today the 1914 date is still being promoted as when Jesus' invisible presence and kingship began, they've stretched things out by changing the understanding of the generation. But that will eventually run out of time. They've probably got, a couple of decades left, and what they'll have to do is change that 1914 date. Somehow shift everything along. Like they've done a lot in the past, they've moved things along. Okay. And the writer of this book, has quite a cynical approach, but that, for example, even though the organisation may be promoting certain dates, they are already planning in advance for the failure of that date, and that's what I think they are doing with the New World Translation revision in Appendix B1. Only about 1914, Satan was hurled from heaven. Nothing about Jesus taking up kingship or anything. So even though they still actively teach 1914, they're preparing the way, they're making the way ahead to actually slowly just withdraw from that date, reduce its significance, and opt for another date, or maybe just no date. So the movement's traditional assumption held the length of King David's reign as the model for Christ's heavenly kingdom in the end times. They assumed Christ's presence or governing period would last at least 40 years under Russell from 1874 to 1914. That's what he taught. Therefore, I conclude, this bloke who wrote this, that all the talk about impending apocalyptic events during those years may have been deliberate speculation of the Society, since, as we have seen, they already had plans for the Society's function 40 or 50 years on, or maybe even longer. Before the reorganisation of the doctrines concerning Christ's second presence, the main leadership clearly made no attempt to dispel the ordinary Bible students' expectations of a speedy ascension to heaven in 1925. Instead, the leadership seems to have deliberately played on them while planning new campaign promotions aimed at the organisation's long-term survival. To support this conclusion, I offer the following from the 7th volume. So, I believe he's quoting from the 7th volume. The year 1914 brought the end of the times of the Gentiles, but not the end of the harvest work. From here it follows that parallel events in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD could point to 1980. It's unclear exactly if the harvest work itself would last that long, or if it implies other aspects of the prophecies. The year 1980 is mentioned in connection with the future re-establishing of the fleshly Israel, but in a context that seems both absurd and confusing. Remember, the re-establishment of the Jews was one event needed to be fulfilled in the course of the Great Trouble before the climax at Armageddon in 1914. I'm kind of a bit lost here, but anyway. As noted earlier, Barber and Russell had expected the re-establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine shortly after 1881, an idea not completely without merit because the press indeed wrote daily columns on the matter. So Barber and Russell were quite abreast of current events, so to speak. Around 1880, the Jews sought to colonise Palestine because they dreamed of a Jewish state under Turkish sovereignty. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Anyway, you get the point, I hope. Alright, I think I've probably... Yeah. I've probably gone on long enough and done my head in for long enough. and probably done your head in. But, I mean, the whole point, coming back to how I started out this video, showing that the image of the cover of the book, The Time is at Hand, and Jesus' warning not to go after such ones. And what we have seen since that time and in leading up to that time, all these different religious groups all trying to lock down a Bible chronology that would guarantee when certain things were going to happen, yet it's all proved to be no more than speculation, really. None of the things that any of them predicted to happen have been observed. It was very convenient to switch to saying things happened invisibly, but still none of the things, 1914, the end of the world, the end of false religion, the start of the millennium, none of these things have eventuated. None of them. So what reason do Jehovah's Witnesses today have to trust that what the current faithful slave is teaching them is actually true? And they really need to seriously think about that, because some of the things that the governing body asks them to do are very damaging, especially when it comes to shunning and cutting off completely anyone who disagrees with these men, who admittedly say that they are not inspired and they are not infallible, that they actually do make error. But then they conveniently blame the error on Jehovah, and it's his way of sifting out right-hearted ones who are serving for the right motives, blah, 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 blah. However, harm is done. Would Jehovah and Jesus really want that? Do they really want people to break up their families and stop speaking to one another just because they do not agree with an opinion of these men who have appointed themselves as a faithful and discreet slave? It doesn't make sense. I don't think Jesus would approve of it at all. Then there are those who have died because they believe the faithful and discreet slave's interpretation of the blood prohibition. What if they're wrong about that? What if they've misinterpreted it? What if they've brought in man-made ideas and speculations and thoughts rather than just sticking strictly to what the scriptures say? What about those who have been sexually abused in the organisation as children, and because they haven't been able to produce a second witness to their abuse, then the matter's been left in Jehovah's hands and has not been reported to the authorities for them to investigate? So there's a lot at stake. So anyway, I think I hope the point I've been trying to make has come through. Honestly, going through this stuff has just done my head in because it's just nonsensical. I hope I haven't left you with the same feeling. Anyway, I'll leave it for there, and goodbye until next time. Bye.